What would differentiate a domestic violence murder versus just a murder charge?
Well, there's not a specific statute that's going to cover domestic violence murder. The murder statute covers both intentional and extremely wanton murder in the same statute in Kentucky.
So is it the same amount of jail time theoretically?
Typically, you're looking. Yes, you're looking at the same penalty range. A murder charge, in Kentucky is going to have a 20 to life or possibly a death penalty sentence attached to it. So they're going to be subject to that range of penalty if they're found guilty.
And especially when it comes to something like murder, is that typically a culmination of a series of abuse? Is there typically a lot of abuse that goes on before it gets to that point?
It certainly can be. It's not always. Once you've shown violence has been committed within, these types of relationships, it can certainly escalate, and it does sometimes.
If someone were to get arrested over the Illinois border, how would that the extradite process work if they were going to get extradited back to Kentucky?
So typically, they're going to issue an extradition warrant that has to be served on that person located in Illinois.
And now, can the suspect choose to fight that?
Yeah, like I said, they can have what's called an extradition hearing. All that hearing has no bearing on whether or not you're guilty of the crime that's named in the arrest warrant. And what the focus of an extradition hearing would be to determine whether or not you are the person named in that warrant. That's incredibly rare that a warrant would have the wrong information, that you're simply not the person that's the subject of the warrant. So a lot of folks will waive that, and there are typically some legal incentives to do that. It quickens the process to get you back into the state with the warrant to resolve the case. Also, it can be beneficial to that person as far as potentially obtaining custody credit for any future sentence, if they agree to waive extradition. So,
and how long would that process typically take?
And that can vary. In my experience, dealing with clients, through extradition issues, obviously, if you're talking about Southern Illinois to Kentucky, that process is not going to take that long because of the distance. Now, if you're talking about, several states over, that can take a few weeks. Typically the state that's issued the warrant is going to be responsible for transportation, and that's usually in Kentucky, it's going to be the sheriff's department of that county that's going to go and pick that person up and transport them back to court or the detention center here to be available for court proceedings. So it can vary. It can be a couple weeks, or sometimes it can be a little bit longer, just depending on the distance involved and whether or not they waive that extradition hearing. If they have the hearing, they can prolong the process a little bit longer, but if they do waive the hearing, that's going to speed it up.
How long typically do murder cases take in the courts?
Obviously, if we're talking about a murder case, or especially like a death penalty case, that's going to take, a good amount of time to get that case to a jury if it doesn't get resolved through a plea agreement. So you're looking, probably every case is different. If you're talking about a case that has a lot of medical evidence or expert testimony that's going to be involved, that's going to take a lot more time as far as to present that to the jury, and for the defense and the prosecution to get those reports ready, and there has to be an exchange there if you have experts with reports as far as between the defense and the prosecution. So it's hard to say, definitively, but you're looking probably roughly at least, a couple of years, if a case is going to go to jury, to be decided.
Now, for victims of domestic violence, what are steps that they can take to get, an order or enabled to do things to kind of get away from their abuser?
So in Kentucky, you can apply for what's called an emergency protective order, and that's going to be a temporary order until the court can hear from both sides and decide whether or not to enter a longer order that's more comprehensive. That's called a domestic violence order, or DVO. Folks, you can have the assistance of attorney to help you file that. It's not required. Typically, your county attorney's office will help assist folks in the filing of those petitions. like I said, you can talk to a private attorney. It could probably help, but it's not required. So what they're looking for are, when we're talking about specifically a domestic violence order, there has to be a specific relationship. And like we talked about earlier, this is a dating relationship, whether you're cohabitating or not, or a marital relationship, or you share a child in common. Those are the factors relationship-wise that they're looking at. And there also has to be either domestic violence has occurred, threats, credible threats to domestic violence. Those types of things are what the court are looking for. But usually, if you can outline what's happened as far as, if you've been, a victim of domestic violence, or, been the victim of serious threat or, serious harassment from somebody that fits that relationship group, the courts typically, they're going to enter that emergency order that's kind of a stopgap until the court can hear from both sides. That's typically going to be in that 14-day range until the court can have a hearing to decide whether or not to extend it. Now, once the court hears from both sides, they can enter what's called a domestic violence order that can last up to 3 years. So that's going to be a much longer period. At the end of that 3 years, if there's a threat that still persists and the court believes so, they can renew that, and there's no limit on how long the court can renew that order. So that hearing is going to involve the petitioner, the person that's been the victim, would have to come to court to testify, to the judge exactly what's happened, what threats have been made, or what acts have been committed. The respondent would have an ability to dispute that. Either party is not required to have an attorney, but it probably does help, I think, as far as facilitating that process. But once those burdens have been met, if the court feels that there has been domestic violence or credible threat, they're going to issue that longer order, that domestic violence order.
And what are the variances in domestic cases? I mean, obviously, we were kind of talking a little bit about murder, but let's just say domestic violence, or your kind of average domestic abuse case. Are there different variances in these cases?
There are. I mean, obviously, like, if we're talking about, lesser degrees of injury or physical contact, there are, like I said, misdemeanor assault 4th degree in Kentucky would be a charge that would cover that. If you've got some physical contact between parties, and that's whether or not there's a visible injury or not, that's still going to cover that, and that's a misdemeanor, but it's still punishable by up to 365 days in jail. Obviously, like, if there is serious injuries or assault, those can progress on up into charges like assault 2nd degree, or strangulation is another charge that we have, a felony charge in Kentucky, and that basically covers any instance where the blood flow or the flow of oxygen is impeded by somebody, and that's another serious charge that can be a Class C felony with a penalty range of 5 to 10 years. So, and we do see that a lot in domestic violence cases, and I think that's why the legislator in Kentucky had adopted that charge of strangulation, because it's a serious indicator that of escalation of violence. So, and I think specifically in regard to domestic violence. So that's been in the last few years that Kentucky's adopted that charge, and you do see a lot of it.
Do we see a lot of repeat offenses or escalating domestic offenses?
You can, and there are laws on the books, especially in Kentucky, as far as like we talked about with misdemeanor domestic violence. If you have a certain number within a short time period, that can also escalate to a felony, whether or not there's a serious injury or not. So there is recourse for folks that have been victims over and over again. Those penalties will increase by statute. So